After a trip to Southern Europe, which was delightful but also hot, and where we went by airplane, we decided that any other trip this summer would be by car. That would automatically be a cooler destination because it would mean staying in Northern Europe. We decided on Sweden, our Nordic neighbor to the east, where we've been several times before. Our two countries are connected historically, which I'll elaborate on a bit later. But they're also literally connected via a bridge, the Öland Bridge. The island I live on is connected to Zealand, the island that Copenhagen is located on, via a bridge as well. So it's easy to travel to Sweden, if also a bit expensive, because the toll on both bridges is surprisingly, and one might add, unnecessarily expensive. After crossing the two bridges, we arrived in Kristianstad in the afternoon, a pleasant town with not so much happening. We found a place to have lunch, which felt delightfully like stepping into a coffee shop in Vienna. Kristianstad, or Kristianstad, is named after the Danish king Christian IV, who founded the town in 1614. The rectangular Renaissance web of streets in the center of town can still be seen. We spent the rest of the day walking around and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. It was a town made for walking. Almost everyone we met said "hey" to us, and we were reminded that Sweden is such a friendly country. Sweden was the first country my youngest daughter ever visited when she was 6 months old, and her name too was arrived at by way of Emil fra Lönneberg. Emil from Lönneberg, one of Astrid Lindgren's wonderful books of stories, in which Emil's mother is called Alma. My great-grandmother was from Sweden, and our house is Swedish. So we feel connected to this country that is a lot like Denmark, but is also distinctly different. It's unusual to go to another country and still be able to speak your own language. My daughter didn't always understand the Swedes, and they notoriously claim not to understand Danish. But we were understood by everyone we talked to during those days. There were free snacks and tea back at our hotel, and we had a casual supermarket dinner and an early night. The next day we crossed one more bridge to our final destination, Öland, and the little town of Färjestad. Our hotel was a lovely yellow wooden house, and the town was peaceful but not dull. We unpacked and then went exploring down by the small marina. The restaurants looked promising. We went into an antique shop and were reminded of two small old tables we have at home that we bought for a song in Sweden years ago. It felt entirely tempting to get a Swedish souvenir, but we really need no more furniture. Then we had our first ice cream, glass, as it's called in Swedish, and went on a little walkabout in the more residential parts of town. There were swoon-worthy houses around every corner. And there was also a little loppis, a garage sale, around nearly every corner. This is how we found those tables years ago, and the loppis abound in Sweden. We soon agreed that, as we had seen before, the Swedes are better at appreciating old things, better than the Danes at any rate, whether it be houses, cars or furniture, something we appreciate. We saw more old Volvos during those 5 days than we see in a year in Denmark. Again, there was free coffee and tea and cookies at our hotel. As if it's a basic human right in Sweden to have your warm beverage and cookies. Another thing we found it easy to appreciate. We drove to a village called Mörbylånga. Another village filled with beautiful traditional wooden houses. As well as one of the wooden mills that we saw all over the island. It was another quiet place. Quaint, cozy, but real, not an open-air museum. We visited mainly small communities on this trip, and Sweden, like all countries, is many things. The country has faced a number of challenges in recent years, and things are of course different in the cities. But I will still continue to claim that it's one of the easiest countries to visit, that it's pleasant, and that people are down to earth, friendly, and often quite nice to look at, as is the whole country. There was also great food to be had. On day 3, we visited Borgen, a castle ruin further up north on the island. The castle foundation dates back to the 12th century, when it was mainly a fortress, a defense against pirates and other hostile foreigners. In the 16th century, it was turned into a Renaissance palace. But war in the early 17th century, between Sweden and Denmark, damaged the castle, and it was gradually turned into a hunting castle. It was more or less forgotten for years, until a new owner began to restore it in the early 1800s, with the aim of turning it into a Baroque palace. Only a few years into the restoration, though, there was a fire, and the castle burned to the ruin that it is now. What it looked like pre-fire and ruin. My daughter got major Maze Runner vibes, as she called it, from a dystopian movie called The Maze Runner, where a group of young people are captured inside a kind of meadow surrounded by huge walls that form a maze. I could completely see what she meant. The walls were so high they almost felt oppressive. We mostly just walked around and enjoyed the view and felt impressed that people had been able to build a structure this immense over 800 years ago. From Borgen Castle, we walked over to Soliden, the summer residence of the Swedish royal family. The house itself is closed to the public, but the garden is open, and it was delightful. We love visiting places like this when we travel. And I'm so grateful that even my teenage daughter is able to appreciate the beauty and the quiet of such a garden. Or at least go along with it and acknowledge that gardens are worthy destinations. I guess as parents we always hope to plant little seeds, no pun intended, and being able to feel delight is a valuable skill, I feel. The house itself is not built in the Swedish style at all, but apparently in the style of houses on the island of Capri. This didn't make it look out of place in my eyes, but serene. The palace was built by the Swedish Queen Victoria in 1906, and it's easy to see the Italian inspiration in the geometrical Renaissance garden at the top. The lower part is inspired more by English parks and gardens, and there's also a little Dutch garden. I documented the names of some of the roses, in case any of the rose and garden lovers out there wanted to copy the Swedish royal family. I noticed they had a number of English roses. The wonderful thing about strolling around in a garden like that is that there isn't anything to do. You're visiting a garden. You're not being productive at all. You have no deadline. It's simply there for you to take in the beauty and breathe and just be. It feels downright medicinal. I remembered reading some years ago about places in Sweden where psychiatric patients were sent into gardens to heal. And judging from my own calm heartbeat and sense of delight and just presence, I think it's not far-fetched to believe that gardens can have an almost dramatic effect on our mental health. We drove down some country byroads on our way back, and that's where you often find the best things. This Airbnb, for instance. And I want to make clear that it's not often I drive and film at the same time. Only when I crawl by at a snail's pace and there's no other traffic. Which I dare say you can't find many places in the world. But you can find it in Sweden. In the evening there was a small concert or sing-along event at our hotel. Something we would never sign up for at home, but we did here. And it was fun to watch many of the locals bringing chairs in the backs of their bikes to sit in the grounds of the hotel. Young and old gathered there, and we had to book a table at our hotel restaurant to make sure we got seats. Dinner was amazing, and when the concert ended an hour after it began and people quietly packed up and left, we mused that in Denmark, people would have carried on for another 2 hours, drank more beer, and been much more noisy. We went for an evening walk down by the little marina. The next day, we drove across the bridge to the mainland to visit the town of Kalmar, which has won prizes for its historical town centre, and which is at the heart of a historical treaty between the 3 Scandinavian countries dating back to 1397. The year before, the 3 kingdoms of Sweden, Norway and Denmark had signed a treaty under the auspices of the Danish Queen Margaret I that established the Kalmar Union, where all 3 realms and parts of modern Finland were ruled by one monarch, the Danish. The 3 countries retained their separate identities in domestic matters, but joined forces in economic and foreign policies. The union lasted for 126 years, until the Swedish king Gustav Vasa left it in 1593. I can recommend the Scandinavian or Danish movie Margrethe den Første or Margaret I for insight into that era. The castle itself is from the end of the 12th century. It was an overcast, windy day, and later it began to rain, but it didn't deter us from walking around the town, first down to the castle by the harbour where that treaty was signed, then later just down random streets. With our castle visit from the day before still fresh in our minds, we decided to forego a visit to the inside of the castle, despite the weather, and instead walked around the old part of town, enjoying once again all the original wooden houses, the type of houses that so inspired our own choice of house. Often when we travel, we make a kind of mental list of good towns and places to visit, and places you can give a miss. Kalmar definitely made the list of places to visit. Despite being the same size as Kristianstad, it somehow had a lot more to offer, we felt. Sorry, Kristianstad. We found a little bakery, or konditori, which is more of a patisserie with cakes and confectionaries, which they have a lot of in Sweden and which we always pay a visit. We decided to treat ourselves to new towels, and with the exchange rate between Swedish and Danish kroner being very favorable just then, we saved quite a bit. Kalmar only has a population of about 40,000, same as Kristianstad, but we've often found that such numbers say little about a town. Instead, perhaps it's the history of a place that permeates it. And certainly Kalmar has plenty of that. In the evening back at Färjestaden, there was a kind of automobile show down by the marina. And we were once again reminded of a wonderful Swedish movie called Änglagården, or House of Angels in English, with its mix of old wooden houses and old cars. Again, something we would never glance at back home, but the rules are different when you travel. It's all part of the cultural experience. Our last evening meal on Öland was the biggest Caesar salad I've ever had at a restaurant by the marina. We watched some of the cars leave afterwards, then walked back to our hotel to pack, more than a little reluctant to be leaving the following day. We may have passed a real estate agent or two, just to browse. The parents went for a last walk in the pleasant little town so the teenager could have some alone time. We had already gotten used to the quiet pace, and had it not been for our daughter, who missed her friends, we might have stayed on in Sweden. On our way back to Denmark the next day, we made a pit stop in Malmo, Sweden's third largest city, to cut the 5.5-hour drive in two, which is normal when you're from a small country. The city is only 30 kilometers from Copenhagen, and we heard so many Danes I felt like I was already back in Denmark. It felt completely different from Kalmar and the little villages we visited on Uland. We went into a lovely shop called Småland, named after the Astrid Lindgren part of Sweden, and felt tempted to buy something, but didn't. Sometimes it's the idea of bringing something home from abroad that appeals rather than the thing itself. And also, we had bought all those towels. They would have to serve as Swedish souvenirs. Astrid Lindgren, the author of Pippi Longstocking, by the way, is featured on the Swedish 20 krona note. In that connection, another Nordic movie I can highly recommend is Astrid, or Young Astrid, about one of my favorite Swedes ever. Tack så mycket, Sverige. Till next time.